Today, we are doing something ambitious. Going way back, over 2.5 millennia, actually, 6th century BC. We're diving into, well, the very foundations of Western philosophy. Ancient Greece, specifically the Pre-Socratics. And we've looked at sources that really emphasize not just what they thought, which was often pretty strange, but why. Connecting these ideas to the politics, the society of the time. Our mission really is to quickly get to the heart of the key conflicts, the really startling concepts that basically set the stage for everyone who followed Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. We're after those aha moments that explain why philosophy exploded there in Greece.
Yeah, and that context is absolutely vital from the get-go.
Bertrand Russell really nailed this. It pointed out that philosophy, when it began, wasn't some isolated academic thing. It was deeply woven into community life. You had this constant back and forth, social conditions allowing new thoughts, and those thoughts then reshaping society. And that synergy, that feedback loop, is exactly what ignited in Greece around the 6th century BC. Okay, so let's unpack this setup. Why Greece? The sources really hammer home that the geography and politics were, well, kind of the perfect storm. Unlike those huge top-down empires like Egypt or Babylon, which were mostly agrarian, Greece was fragmented. Little independent city-states, heavily reliant on sea trade.
And that sea trade, that's a huge differentiator. I mean, think about it. If your whole economy depends on sailing around, meeting different peoples, different beliefs, well, the power of a single inherited way of thinking, that kind of orthodoxy, it starts to weaken, doesn't it? Trade naturally pushes towards individualism, questioning things. Politically, too, these places, especially cities in Ionia like Miletus, they were, let's say, dynamic. Lots of instability, but also rapid change. You saw shifts from monarchy, sometimes to tyrants, then often ending up in some form of democracy or even plutocracy ruled by the wealthy.
Right, constant political experiments happening.
Exactly. And add to that mix, they picked up the phonetic alphabet from the Phoenicians, that was crucial, and started using coinage, which they got the idea from Lydia nearby. These weren't just, administrative tools. They fueled literacy, trade, individualism. They really helped break down that old centralized power.
But it wasn't all just trade routes and voting. Our sources stress this internal tension within Greek culture itself, like two currents running side by side. You had the passionate, sort of mystical Dionysian side, and then the sober, rational, almost scientific impulse. And understanding that conflict is key, apparently.
Right. If we look at that passionate side first, you start with things like the Bacchic rites, centered on Dionysus, and involved this state they called enthusiasm, literally the god within, which often meant, well, serious intoxication, frenzy, sometimes even pretty savage acts, honestly. It was about losing yourself in the group.
Okay, wild stuff. But then, as you said, the Greeks rationalized even that. Orphism comes in and seems to, well, clean it up, act as a kind of reform.
Precisely. Orphism channels that same desire for something beyond the ordinary, but turns it into a spiritual discipline. They brought in asceticism, denying the self for higher goals, things like not eating animal flesh. And the core belief, the really revolutionary part, was transmigration of the soul. The idea that the soul is divine, immortal, but it's tragically stuck in the body as a prison or a tomb, essentially.
So instead of ecstatic frenzy, the goal becomes purification. You live a pure life to escape this wheel of birth, this cycle of reincarnation, and achieve some kind of eternal bliss. How did that idea, coming from a religious movement, end up influencing philosophers like Plato?
Oh, the influence was massive. Because the Orphics gave philosophy this powerful concept, the soul, as something totally separate from and superior to the body. That mind-body dualism, that's the bedrock for so much that comes later. Thinkers like Pythagoras and definitely Plato, they pick up this idea and run with it. Abstract forms, immortality, the perfect state. A lot of that ethical and metaphysical focus might not have happened, or happened very differently, without that Orphic influence separating mind from matter.
Okay, so that's the mystical side, searching for the eternal soul. But then you have the other current, the rational, almost scientific one, trying to define the eternal substance of the actual physical world. This brings us to the Milesian school over in Ionia. This is really where science, or maybe proto-science, gets going, right? They stopped blaming gods and started asking, what's everything made of?
Exactly. And the first name, Thales, often called the very first philosopher, his big idea was, well, maybe everything is ultimately made of water. Seems simple now, maybe a bit naive, but the approach was revolutionary, seeking a natural, observable principle, an A instead of a myth. And he wasn't just theorizing. He was applying knowledge, predicting that eclipse in 585 BC, using geometry learned from Egypt to figure out, pyramid heights, ship distances, practical stuff.
Okay, water is something you can see, touch, but then an Aximander comes along and takes this huge leap into abstraction.
Yes, this is a massive step. An axiomator basically says, hold on, if the fundamental thing is water, how do you explain fire or earth? They seem opposite. So he reasoned the ultimate substance can't be any one of the things we know. It has to be something more basic, something undefined, limitless. He called it the apeiron, the infinite or boundless. He's the first one we know of who posits a fundamental reality that's not directly observable.
Wow. Okay, so moving from concrete stuff to an abstract idea of the source.
Precisely. And he even adds this concept of cosmic justice, that elements sort of pay back each other for their dominance, always returning to that infinite source, maintaining a balance. He drew the first known map, too. Then Anaximenes, the third in that school, kind of splits the difference. He says the fundamental substance is something known, air. But he argues it transforms. When it gets thinner, rarefied, it becomes fire. When it condenses, it becomes wind, then cloud, then water, earth, even stone.
So still a single substance, but explaining variety through a process.
Exactly. Condensation and rarefaction. Across all three Milesians, though, the key thing is that commitment to finding a single natural explanation for the world.
All right, so the Milesians established this search for a fundamental stuff. But the very next generation just blows up into what seems like the central philosophical fight, maybe ever. Is reality all about constant change, or is it fundamentally static, unchanging? This is where, as you say, the gloves really come off. Heraclitus versus Parmenides?
Yeah, this is a main event for the Pre-Socratics in many ways. Heraclitus, he was an aristocrat from Ephesus, and he championed flux. Constant change. His famous lines capture it. All things are flowing. You can't step into the same river twice. For him, the underlying reality was change. His fundamental element, fire, always flickering, transforming. And crucially, he believed strife, or conflict, war is the father of all, he said, wasn't bad. It was essential. The tension between opposites creates harmony.
Okay, constant change, fire, strife creates order. Got it. And then Parmenides walks in and just slams on the brakes, says it's all an illusion.
Pretty much. Parmenides from Elea in Italy directly refutes Heraclitus. He argues purely through logic that change, motion, even variety, it's all impossible, it can't happen. The only true reality, he claimed, is the one. A single, unchanging, eternal, indivisible, spherical plenum. Everything else our senses tell us. Deception. He makes this sharp distinction. The way of truth, logic, versus the way of opinion, our senses.
Wait, hold on. He used logic and language to argue that the physical world we see moving and changing is fake. How did that even work? That seems counterintuitive.
It is counterintuitive, but the argument was powerful, especially then. It hinges on language, really. Parmenides essentially argued you can only think about and speak about what is. You cannot logically grasp what is not non-existence, the void. If you try to think of nothing, you're still thinking of something, namely the concept of nothing.
Okay, so if you can name it, it exists in some way.
That's the core of it.
Yeah.
Therefore, he concludes, what is not cannot exist. And if there's no not, no void, then movement is impossible, nothing to move into, and change is impossible, because that would mean something going from is not to is, or is to is not. Both are unthinkable.
Wow. Okay, that's a philosophical checkmate almost. It forces everyone after him to grapple with how change can be possible if his logic holds.
Exactly. It created a huge problem that later philosophers had to solve.
So you've got this total deadlock. Heraclitus says everything flows. Parmenides says nothing can flow. How did philosophy get out of that corner? Who tried to bridge this gap?
Well, the first major attempt at synthesis comes from Empedocles. He was a fascinating figure, philosopher, scientist, religious prophet, even a democratic politician down in Sicily. He basically says, okay, Parmenides is right that fundamental stuff doesn't come into or go out of being. So let's have four eternal elements: earth, air, fire, and water. They always exist.
Okay, so permanence at the root level.
Right. But then, to explain change and variety, which Heraclitus observed, Empedocles introduces two cosmic forces. Love, which pulls the elements together, mixes them, and strife, which pushes them apart, separates them. So the elements themselves are eternal, but their combinations change, driven by love and strife. That allows for the world we see without violating Parmenides' core logic about what is.
A clever compromise. And then taking things in a much more purely physical direction, you get the atomists, Leucippus and his student Democritus.
Yes, the atomists offer a different solution, and one that feels incredibly modern in some ways. They agree with Parmenides that being itself is permanent, indivisible. But they say this applies to an infinite number of tiny, physically real particles, atoms. Atoma means uncuttable. These atoms are eternal, indestructible, solid.
Okay, so tiny bits of Parmenidean one.
Sort of. But crucially, to allow for movement and change, they reintroduced the concept Parmenides rejected, the void, empty space. So you have atoms, which are what is, moving around in the void, which is what is not. They collide, they hook together, they separate, and all the variety of the world arises from the different shapes, sizes, and arrangements of these atoms in the void.
And this is huge because it's a purely mechanical explanation, right? No love and strife, no divine purpose.
Exactly. This is the radical step. Atomism explained everything through the necessary random collisions of atoms. No need for teleology, that idea of a purpose, a final cause, a creator guiding things. The universe, for them, just is, running according to the nature of atoms and void. Democritus even argued that the qualities we perceive like hot, cold, sweet, bitters aren't in the atoms themselves. They're just effects on our senses caused by the atom shapes and arrangements. Our senses, he thought, give us only conventional knowledge, not the truth about atoms and void. It's incredibly influential for later science.
So we've gone from water to the infinite, to air, to fire and flux, then the unchanging one, then elements moved by love and strife, and finally to atoms and the void, this amazing explosion of trying to figure out the cosmos. But then as we get into the 5th century BC, the focus seems to shift away from the universe and towards, well, us, towards man and society.
That's right. You start seeing the rise of the sophists, especially in Athens. These were traveling teachers, often very skilled in rhetoric, teaching young men how to succeed in the new democratic polis. And their leading figure, Pythagoras, drops this bombshell. Man is the measure of all things. Meaning there's no absolute objective truth outside of human perception or convention. What's true for you might not be true for me. What's good is what works, what's useful, what the community agrees on. This is radical relativism. Wisdom isn't about knowing the cosmos. It's about persuading people in the assembly or winning your case in court.
Okay, so that skepticism about finding any ultimate truth about the world naturally leads philosophy inward, to ethics. And this is where Socrates comes in.
Exactly. Socrates is reacting directly against both the cosmological speculations he felt led nowhere and the relativism of the sophists, which he saw as dangerous. He famously said he knew nothing, but his whole project was about finding stable definitions for ethical concepts: justice, virtue, piety. He used his dialectic method, that relentless questioning, to force people to examine their own beliefs.
And his big claim was, virtue is knowledge.
Yes. If you truly know what is good, you will inevitably do what is good. Ignorance is the root of evil. So the focus becomes entirely internal. Know thyself. He wasn't interested in atoms. He was interested in the health of the soul. And this intense focus, guided by his inner daimon, that divine sign or voice he claimed warned him against certain actions, well, it famously got him into trouble, accused of impiety, corrupting the youth.
Right, and all this intellectual ferment is happening primarily in Athens, this chaotic, vibrant democracy. It's useful maybe to quickly contrast it with its big rival, Sparta, just to see the alternative.
Definitely. Sparta is the polar opposite in almost every way. It's a rigid, militaristic aristocracy built on the backs of a huge population of serfs, the Helots. In Sparta, the state is everything. Stability, obedience, military prowess, those are the highest values. Not freedom, not art, not commerce, certainly not philosophical speculation.
So Athens' intellectual freedom may be bordering on chaos, and Sparta's rigid order may be bordering on stagnation.
That's a good way to put it. Aristotle noted Sparta's constitution was complex, designed for permanence. And later thinkers, including Plato when he wrote the Republic, actually looked to Sparta, or an idealized version of it, as a model. They saw the perceived instability and moral relativism of Athenian democracy as a flaw, and admired Sparta's disciplined structure, even while acknowledging its harshness. That tension between freedom and order runs through all of Greek thought and politics. #outro.
Okay, so we've really covered some ground here. From Thales thinking it's all water, through the Orphics looking for a pure soul, Democritus imagining mechanical atoms, and finally Socrates turning the focus inward to ethics, asking how should we live? And this whole incredible journey, this birth of philosophy, it seems, was only possible because of that unique mix in Greece. Political freedom, trade, and that deep internal conflict between mystical belief and rational inquiry.
Absolutely. What's really striking when you look back is how those initial questions, those fundamental disputes the Pre-Socratics raise, they just don't go away. Even when their specific answers seem, primitive to us now, the problems they identified What is real? What is change? How do mind and matter relate? What is the basis of morality? Those are still the questions driving philosophy, science, even theology today. They literally invented the vocabulary for talking about reality.
That's a great point. And we mentioned earlier how later political ideas like liberalism were described in our sources as trying to find a way out of that cycle of anarchy and tyranny, trying to get stability without resorting to dogma. So, thinking about that very first foundational philosophical fight we discussed, flux versus permanence, Heraclitus' constant change versus Parmenides' unchanging stability, here's something to maybe chew on. What version of that fundamental conflict between relentless change and the desire for stable truth or order do you think our own society is still wrestling with today? Something to consider until our next deep dive.